Seva said, John Dickson apologized that he couldn't be here today. He had a family thing come up, but asked me to deliver this. So if you like this talk, it's due to the high quality of my delivery. If you don't like it, it's because the deck is crappy. It's just, so what we want to talk about today is a little bit of the work that has been going on with the OpenSAMM project and some things that we've learned in working with organizations, especially organizations that are making the move to agile or DevOps types of approaches. Want to talk about some lessons learned that we've found along the way on how you can have more success in those environments. You know, if you think of how many people are familiar with the CMMI, capability maturity model, right? You see a lot of organizations that talk about DevOps and CMMI in the same sentence, right? No, because they're in a lot of ways they're the opposite of one another. And so what we've found is a resistance in a lot of cases for organizations that are pushing more agility and pushing for more DevOps. We've seen a resistance to using or relying on any sort of a maturity model. So I want to talk a little bit about some things we've found that have helped us have success with those, or to use a framework like OpenSAMM in those environments. A little bit of background. We'll provide a little bit of background. Talk about an overview of the software assurance maturity model. We'll talk about a little bit about some of the work that we've done with some benchmarking data that we're trying to gather based on OpenSAMM. Then I'll talk about the business drivers that a lot of organizations find themselves in that cause them to make moves to adopt more agile practices and adopt more DevOps practices. And one of the things, it's interesting talking to different groups. I suspect this group will be more receptive. When I speak at ISSA or a lot of very more traditional security groups, they can't believe, they're blown away by the thinking of Agile and DevOps and don't think that their organization will ever adopt it. Well, they're wrong. So we'll talk a little bit about the business drivers that make this a reality. Again, in an OWASP environment with more of a development culture, I suspect that this group understands a lot more of the push for Agile, the push for DevOps. Then we'll talk about strategies that we've found to make OpenSAMM more effective, or how you can have more success with OpenSAMM initiatives in organizations that are pushing for more agility in DevOps. And again, happy to answer any questions along the way. I just need to remember to repeat the question, which I did approximately 40% of the time in the previous talk. That's a picture of John Dickson, who is not here today. That's a picture of me, and I am here today. And again, I mentioned this previously. One salient or relevant thing about my background is, I'm a developer by background. Did a lot of server-side Java stuff in the mid to late 90s, a lot of early ASP.NET stuff in the early 2000s, and really for the last decade, what I've done in my career is helped or looked at how developers and the software that they build, how that impacts the security of the organizations that are fielding those systems. And so I'm a developer who has come into the world of security, as opposed to being someone from a more traditional network security, network penetration testing background that is now looking at web and mobile apps. And so from a culture standpoint, I think that puts me in a situation also to understand a lot of what is going on with the push for Agile, with the push for DevOps, and hopefully that's of value. So an important thing to understand is that value and risk are not equally distributed. If your organization has a portfolio of 100 applications or 1,000 applications, the value in that portfolio is not, each application is not the same. Some applications matter more than others. They have more valuable data, they have different types of data, and that makes them more valuable to the organization. There may be, if you look at the value of the transaction being processed by an application, if you look at the cost of downtime, the cost of a breach, also, privacy, regulatory concerns. There's a saying that if everything is important, then nothing is important, right? Or if you ascribe the same amount of importance to everything, then then that importance can be like 100 units of importance or 1 million units of importance because it's all spread equally, and that robs from you the ability to make decisions and prioritize. And I think that's something that's very important as you try to develop software security programs. You have limited resources at your disposal, and that forces you to ruthlessly prioritize and to make risk-based decisions. And as a result of this, all applications shouldn't be treated the same, and all teams developing applications shouldn't be treated the same. And we'll talk more about this coming up, but I think an important thing to recognize when you look at the concept of maturity from any standpoint, really, in an organization, but if you look at the concept of maturity as it relates to the security practices of a development team, you're really talking about the security practices of a development team. And so if you go into any organization of any size, any organization of any size, and what you'll find is they don't have one way that they do development, right? They have as many different ways of doing development as they have teams. A couple of years ago, I went into an organization, a retail organization, and said, okay, well, for PCI prep purposes, we need to talk about your methodology. And they pointed to the wall with a 4 foot by 8 foot, whatever that translates to in meters, but a piece of plywood-sized poster on the wall and said, that's our development methodology. And it had little boxes and arrows and all that thing. And I said, okay, and so this is how everybody does their work? And, yeah, okay, good. So for your team, explain to me how you do this part of the QA process. And they're like, well, our team doesn't actually do that, right? As we drilled down, again, what we identified was every team was doing something different because they had different drivers, they had different, a number of different factors. And so you can't treat all applications the same, and you can't treat all teams the same. And so that's something also to understand as you go into your organization. A team that's developing line of business applications that are internal facing, they're probably going to have a different set of security practices and a different level of maturity when compared to a team that is developing a internet facing high transaction volume XYZ application. And that's great, but that's also an important thing, I think, for folks to understand as they try to push these programs out and as they try to grow the maturity of those programs is you're going to have different factors, different business factors that are ultimately going to determine the business's appetite for risk, and that will then translate into different activities within that specific team. So there's a number of software assurance frameworks out there. There's the Flask, there's the Microsoft's SDL. Microsoft SDL has different variants. There's any number of different frameworks out there. And with SAMM, the intent was to create an open framework that helps organizations to figure out where they are, what is the maturity level of a given team, and to make plans to advance the security of that team or determine what does the roadmap need to be for this particular group. Where are we now and where do we want to get to? One of the things I like about SAMM, and I talked earlier about CMMI. Has anybody here ever done work in an organization that is a CMMI ranked organization? Anybody? Okay, a couple unlucky people. Most everybody lucky or luckier, right? What I've always found with CMM and CMMI is they are overwhelming. I mean, they're crushing amounts of paperwork, crushing amounts, right? And at the end of the day, from a commercial standpoint, I would characterize as being not terribly successful. And I think maybe I'm being charitable with that characterization. In the U.S., we really only saw government contractors and like offshore firms, trying to claim, some sort of quality with their processes. Those are the only organizations that really cared about it on the government contractor side because there were certain purchasing requirements in certain cases. Again, the offshore folks trying to demonstrate a level of competence from a branding standpoint. But we really, we don't see any commercial organizations that have widespread adoption of CMMI. So one thing I like, and again, I think it's because it's overbearing and it's too complicated. One of the things I like about SAMM is that it is much simpler and less onerous. But as we've seen going out and working with organizations, even SAMM's level of rigor causes heartburn with certain organizations. And so, if you look at the structure of SAMM, there are 4 different business functions. You look at your governance. What's the overall environment in which software is being done in this organization? You have your construction. What are you doing during the building of the software to help ensure that security is appropriately included? There's verification. After we've built the software, what activities are we undertaking in order to test to make sure we are successful, putting the appropriate properties in, and then operations. And I think as we see OpenSAMM evolve, and Save, you may have thoughts on this, but I think as we see OpenSAMM evolve, especially looking to make it relevant inside of organizations that are pushing for DevOps, I think we're going to start to see more thought or some growth or expansion of the things that you look for from a maturity standpoint at operations. As we start to break down the barriers between operations and security and development, I think that that's an area that's going to, we're going to see more, turmoil is probably the wrong word, but additional velocity of changes for that part of the model. Underneath each of those business functions, there's 3 different security practices are defined, and again, I think for under operations, we're going to see some changes there. So, if you look at using OpenSAMM in practice, the way we've typically done these assessments is go into an organization, gather some data, go interview various stakeholders, and then the organization gets a scorecard. So across those 12 security practices, you get a rating from 0, meaning you're doing nothing, to 3, meaning you're at the highest level of maturity. Again, I think a lot of organizations have found this to be a very valuable tool. It's not as complicated as CMMI. It's much more tractable. You can come in, you can see a set of steps that you can use to advance the state of your practices. So you've got a yardstick measuring where you are now, as well as giving you some actionable steps to move forward. And from this, we've started to collect data along with other folks in this OpenSAMM benchmarking initiative. And so what we're doing is we're taking data from a number of organizations and we're anonymizing it and starting to create a data set that we can start to use for industry benchmarking. So an organization can say, I'm a finance or I'm a banking and finance organization with 10,000 people. I look at our peers and I see in these areas they're more advanced than us. In these areas we seem to be more advanced. That lets me go to management and say, here's how I compare to my peers. That's something that's is valuable because it lets you see what other people are doing. And really, business leaders crave data. That's a real challenge that I think we've seen in the application or software security space is too often the business perceives it as good hygiene, right? Like, you should take a shower every day, but you don't have to, right? And I think a lot of organizations look at software security that way, where they say, yeah, we should be doing all that, but I actually need to do this other stuff. I need to get these features deployed as well. And that's that's been a challenge, I think, for OWASP trying to make application security visible and to get organizations to make those risk-based decisions about what they do in their programs. But now what we can start to do is we can start to build up a set of data, and that lets you say, here's where we are, and here's where other organizations like us are. That's one of the things that I think is really valuable about the data sets that have been released from the White Hat folks and the Veracode folks looking at vulnerability prevalence remediation rates. That lets you point to this third-party data set and say, here's how many vulnerabilities people in these industries are finding. Here's what the percentage they're fixing, and here's what they're fixing. Let's look at how we're doing in our organization, and that gives us at least a justification to say other people who are presumably smart are doing it to this level. If we want to be presumably smart, we should probably be at their level as well. All right? There's because organizations want to make sure that they're not late to the party, right? But they also want to make sure that they're not overspending. And so, a big focus for us was to start to drill down and get data at the team level rather than the organization level. Because again, in any organization of size that you go into, they have any number of different development teams, and they probably have a different set of practices for each development team. There may be common infrastructure that is shared, there may be common practices or training that is shared, but especially if you look at organizations that have grown through acquisitions, organizations that are geographically distributed, if you go into an organization and say, what are you doing for application security? And they say, we use static scanner XYZ. An excellent question is, well, what percentage of your code actually goes through that scanner? Or we do pen testing with ABC. Let's talk about what percentage, what is the coverage level that you have? And again, so that's something I think is very important. When you look at the maturity, you need to look at the maturity of an individual team, because as you see, certain teams are going to be adopting different sets of practices, meaning they're going to be at different levels of maturity. Another thing, just talking about the data model that we've used for this benchmarking. Again, the granularity is at the team level versus being at the organization level. And we also are collecting organization and team metadata. So looking at what's the employee count, where we can get at some information about the count of developers versus the count of application security folks. What is the industry or sector that organization is in, and also what regions that organization. What organization, where is that organization based? And we allow you to capture this data at different levels of granularity, either at, again, a lot of the historical data that we have is at the organization level, but now we're starting to gather information to the team level. And so the data model allows you to capture information at both of those levels. And then when you query that data set, the idea is that you can limit it to the set of views. You can either accept more data where you're going to get more variability and potentially less data quality, or you can constrain it and say, well, I only want to know what certain teams are doing, in which case there's going to be less data available, but data that may have qualities that you prefer. So what limits SAMM adoption in the, in the real world? The same thing that limits it all the time is ambitious development timelines. And that gives, in a lot of organizations, that gives too many development teams the ability to say, like, no thanks. Like, oh, hey, you want to come in and look at our maturity? You want to get us doing security stuff? No thanks. We've got a deadline, right? That's something that we see all too often. Certain regulatory regimes have helped to make this less of an option for development teams. Other organizations, often after a breach, get a little bit more of the religion. That's a challenge in a lot of organizations. And again, it comes down to limited resources. All right, if I have developers and they're spending time filling out SAMM surveys and talking about their security roadmap, they're not fixing bugs, they're not implementing new features. And there's also politics. There's in a lot of organizations, there's a push and pull between the different lines of business and their development teams versus the security organization. Some organizations have a centralized security team that is very strong. Others, security is more of an afterthought. Some organizations have very strong audit, internal IT audit departments. Again, each organization is different, and in a lot of cases, the politics makes it challenging to adapt something like SAMM. And again, there's always other competing priorities. Time spent doing security is time spent not doing something else. And time spent talking about your maturity and your roadmap is time spent not doing something else that could have been done. So if we look at the big drivers that we're seeing, and this is again. If you look at startup companies, they've always had this mentality. But what we're starting to see increasingly in the financial services space, which is traditionally an industry that moves, values security and moves comparatively slow versus startups are a increasing desire for speed. And we're seeing organizations that we never thought would talk about this before. They're saying like, yes, we've decided that we're going to be agile. I wish I had a copy. There's a great Dilbert cartoon there where the pointy-haired boss says, hey, we're going to start doing agile development, where instead of doing any design or testing or anything like that, we're just going to start writing code and complaining immediately. And Wallace says, this is great. And then the point here boss says, and that description consists of your training, right? So a lot of organizations don't necessarily understand what Agile is. They understand what DevOps is, but they know they want it, which is a little scary. But it's happening because there is a real drive for the time to market advantages. How can we move faster? How can we move quicker? I think we're also seeing with certain things in Agile and DevOps is a desire to increase quality, and there's also cost concerns. And this is important, and again, something I think will be more accepted by this audience versus an ISSA or an ISACA. Just like a lot of migration to cloud didn't come from a great strategy, it came from the lines of business demanding, we need this flexibility, we have to be able to do this, therefore if you're in my way, I'm just going to go around you. Similarly, I think DevOps pressures aren't going to come from the smartest CIO of the year who's like, what we need to do, guys? DevOps, right? Instead, it's going to come from the development teams that said, hey, we need to be able to deploy more quickly. We need to be able to build features faster. We need to be able to respond to our competition. And our current constraints or the current practices we have are holding us back from doing that. How do we get to DevOps? This is an interesting, this may not be entirely technically correct, but I think captures, especially if you look at it from a business standpoint, in the good old days, everybody had their own silo and got left alone just to do whatever they wanted to do in the waterfall days, right? So you had like, okay, well, write me the requirements document and hand that off, and I don't need to talk to your people, just make sure that you have enough system shells, right? The world figured out like, hey, this doesn't work. And so you got Agile, which is really looking at combining these business users with the developers, right? How do we get a customer sit with us and explain these requirements so that we can be more responsive? The next move that we're seeing now is looking and saying, hey, having the business work with development and build the software they want is great, but it's not great when you throw that over the wall and operations can't support it and we have downtime and it takes us too long to roll forward, roll back, and other things like that. And so that's what you see with a lot of the move to DevOps, which is saying, how do we make change even faster? How do we make these increments auditable? But how do we break down the walls between the folks that are developing the software and the folks that have to support it in operations? I think that creates a great opportunity for security to also get involved in this and say, hey, I have a set of concerns, and I have a set of tools that I think can help you accomplish your goals. I don't know if any folks here were in Aaron Weaver's talk, the first talk in this session. Really great view. I think he's got a great view talking about, like, we need to make these security tools that are easier to use by the developers, because if we can do that, then developers might actually use them, and then we're going to see more adoption of these tools. So looking at and how do we make all of this stuff work together so that security can no longer, or can be viewed less as an impediment and more of an enabler and a risk manager. So again, I think that the shift to DevOps is a great opportunity for software security teams. The challenge is, how do you layer in the things that security more traditionally cares about? Looking at the maturity of practices, looking at these things like auditability, things of that nature. How can you apply those techniques in organizations that are just like focused on, I need to go faster and do DevOps, whatever that might be. So again, more reasons to do SAMM. Talking about the opportunity cost. All right, it's if you're going to create a roadmap and follow that roadmap, a big pushback that we've seen in a lot of organizations is nobody wants to get a big 0 on the report. Right? If a development team is not doing any security stuff, it's almost a waste of time to come in and say, like, okay, we're going to do your OpenSAMM assessment. Talk to me about your static analysis program. And they're like, don't have one. Talk to me about your dynamic analysis program. Don't have one. Talk to me about your security metrics. Don't have any, right? And so you go down with the clipboard and you're like, nope, 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 nope. Right? That's number one. That's not fun. That's also a horrible waste of time in those cases, right? And and in a lot of cases, it is a very expensive way to do a heavy-handed assessment of a team. Is a expensive way to confirm what you already knew. And typically what you knew is that, this team has fewer security practices. We bought them a tool, they're not using it. We got them some training, those people all left or forgot it, or they haven't been encouraged to make use of it. We told them to do security requirements, and it's a one-page of bullet points, whatever that might be. So what can you do to help increase the uptake of a maturity model, specifically OpenSAMM? So it's important to show value early in the process. That's a critical thing. If people are asking, like, what am I, why are we doing this? You've got to be able to show them, well, we're doing this because what it gets us is this thing of value. Also looking at ways to make the data capture as simple as possible. This is also something where you've got to work across the different teams to see where you can get them to potentially help you with that. And honestly, this is something that if you want to be successful is typically done in an iterative fashion. It's not something where you can come in from the top down and expect to get deep coverage across your entire set of across the entire set of teams that you have developing software in your organization. And you've got to be flexible. You've got to be ready and able to pivot. So one of the things that we found to be valuable is that benchmarking, to be able to say, like, hey, if you think your team is so great and smart, and like the Etsy guys are doing 50 deploys per minute, and you're doing 51 deploys per minute, and you're totally awesome DevOps pipeline, how can you show, or you can show value by benchmarking, right? How do you stack up against other players in the industry, about other folks? How do you show value to these development teams to show, hey, if you adopt these security practices, you're going to find these vulnerabilities earlier in the process. You're going to move this to the left of the process. All right. Also, we've looked at ways, how do you make SAMM less disruptive? How do we make it so that it isn't a giant burden? It doesn't feel like an audit when someone comes through. And how do you communicate the success of SAMM to show, like, hey, we've done this assessment of our maturity, we've made progress in our maturity with these teams in these areas, and here's the benefit that those teams saw from that. So again, first important strategy is conduct data-driven benchmarking. And that's something we've found that is a great, I don't know if it's the right justification, but it's one that often tends to work. If you can show, here's data about what you guys are doing, and here's data about what your peers are doing, nobody wants to be behind their peers. And this is something where you can often pick a team and baseline their maturity. So pick a team, especially in a situation where you think you're going to have positive results, and start to use them as a case study. And that's something, we were working with a really large enterprise. And again, they had 500 dev teams or something spread throughout the organization. And the central security people said, we know most of these people are horrible, right? But we think that these three teams, because of the lines of business or the products that they're responsible for, we think that these three teams are actually using XYZ tools that we've bought for them, that they're using this stuff. Well, that let us go in and say, well, let's take a look. Since it's not going to be zeros across the board, let's go and look at what it is realistic for a team inside of this enterprise to accomplish, right? Because they've made some decisions, they've adopted some of these tools, they've got organization-specific information. Let's go and let's use these folks as the example, because then you can start to say, well, where do you guys, other teams in this organization, where do you want to fall in relation to these people? And then you can start to go out from them. Again, initially looking for pockets of excellence. You want to like catch somebody doing something right. I think I read in a management book once. You want to go find the teams that are actually doing something right, so that you can highlight those, and then start to use those as your examples moving forward. And collecting this data for benchmarking is a necessary evil, and the emphasis here is on necessary. If you're not collecting this data, then it makes it more challenging to point to those teams and just say, well, those guys are good at doing code analysis. It's much better if you can go and say, look, those guys have incorporated the source code analysis into their weekly build across the 10 applications in the portfolio they're responsible for, right? These guys have a certain level of maturity, and they're getting value out of the activities that they're doing. And so, being able to collect that data and point to it with specific and in measurable terms gives you that yardstick to use across other parts of the organization. Streamlining the collection process. There's a number of tricks here. In some organizations, you can invoke a higher authority. Hey, the internal audit said you had to do this. In some organizations, that'll get you laughed out of the room. In some organizations, they'll say, what's internal audit? In other organizations, they'll say, oh, internal audit said it. Well, I guess I'd better do it so that I don't have this person down here later on. Hopefully you have some existing things like an application inventory that you can use to help give a starting point. You may already have some of the information that you have in an organization. Also, another thing that we've found is that if you look across the 4 big areas of OpenSAMM, the governance function tends to be, there's less drift within an enterprise. They may have very different construction, verification, and operations practices if they're have different lines of business responsible for each of those things. But there does tend to be more commonality or more overlap with governance, just because you have an organization in the financial services space, they're going to have a team that is responsible for certain aspects of compliance, and so you may see more commonalities. So you may be able to give teams a starting point to say, hey, from a governance standpoint, this is what we usually see in teams inside this organization. Let's talk about how you guys potentially vary from that, or what of this we can just automatically reuse. Different organizations work in different ways. In some organizations, you can send out a self-assessment or send out assessment forms to folks, via some sort of a workflow, and people, some percentage will respond to them. Usually, like regardless of anything, you're usually not going to get immediate responses from a high percentage. But some organizations, people are better at working on their own and providing this information. In other ones, you've got to go more hand-to-hand combat and team to team and say, hey, let's schedule a time, let's sit down for a lunch, let's have a coffee, and we can work through this worksheet that you all have. And again, doing this in person is typically you would do as a last result, but that may be the thing that's required in your organization to get them to behave or to get them to comply with the behaviors that you want to see. And you want to make sure that you're minimizing the impact on development teams. Because at the end of the day, that's the thing that's going to really impact your efforts, is if you're perceived as taking value away from those development teams. And also, bribes are incredibly effective, which you can bribe with Amazon, you can bribe with Starbucks. That's something that we've found can be very helpful. Even if it's a minimal thing, I think there's a human nature response where if somebody gives you something, like they feel bad if you don't give anything back. And so that's something where even minimal gifts or incentives, you can help get people moving. And so that's something where if you look and say, how much does each of these in-person meetings cost? Oh, okay, well, for my time, cool. Well, it's worth a $25 gift card to something if, for each one of these meetings I can skip because I got this person to fill out that survey. So if you look at the flexibility of, or the trade-off between budget and time and various resources, that may be an option. One of the things we've also found is that you have to be flexible in the depth of the data that you expect to get from these teams. And there may be value in going in a breadth first. After you've got your initial cases, there may be value in going in a breadth first approach. Let's learn at least a little bit about what every team is doing, and then we can start to fill in the gaps from there. To find out, hey, we bought this tool. Let's go and talk to all these teams about their static analysis practices or their dynamic analysis practices, so that we can at least know, is this tool being used, or do we need to push this rollout? And so you can make decisions to go deep for a specific team to know a lot about their practices, or you may want to go shallow and just say, hey, I want to know about training, or I want to know about what sort of testing you're doing, or I want to know if you're doing threat modeling. And so you're looking at a preliminary lightweight survey so that you can start to identify the teams at the most risk, or where there's a larger mandate, and those are the teams then where it's easier to go in and go much deeper. So looking at breadth, looking at a couple of different teams versus depth, saying we've got we've got a little bit about every team. And again, you may have different factors, and it really comes down to the 80-20 rule of like, what's the information that's going to be the easiest for me to collect from these teams so that I can start to assemble a view into this without being perceived as being in the way of progress. And finally, you need to explicitly communicate value to the leadership and to the development managers. And this is again, a critical aspect. You've got to be able to justify to say, hey, we did, this SAMM assessment, which is not in and of its own, it's not in and of itself, isn't necessarily inherently valuable, but by advancing this team's maturity from here to here, we've decreased their bug resolution time from here to here, right? We've been able to, we took action, we trained these developers, and because we trained these developers, now we're introducing fewer security vulnerabilities, right? Or, now that we have a security testing that's being incorporated into the development process, now we're reducing, we're putting 80% fewer bugs out, security bugs out into production. So you've got to be able to demonstrate this value, showing as people increase in maturity, you have good outcomes on the other side of that. And again, this is a situation where if this were a technical problem that could be solved, I would be much happier because I'm good at solving technical problems. The challenge is it's an organizational behavior problem. It's a management problem, and those are, at least for me, those are certainly less tractable. But again, being able to communicate these things. We've also seen some interesting stuff with gamification, to be able to show these teams against one another to show, well, hey, this team has adopted this set of practices, right? Nobody wants to be last on the leaderboard. Similar to looking, if you want to go to management and justify to say, well, we need to do this in our enterprise because other enterprises are doing more or doing better stuff. Within teams, nobody wants to be last on the leaderboard, and so and that's not even necessarily a business justification. But if you can elicit the response that you want, who cares? And so that's something where those sort of like gamification models. I think there's some really interesting stuff that could be done there, and having organizations or having groups compete on maturity, is something that we've seen. We've seen get some teams to start to take steps and to move forward where they'd previously been reticent to do that because nobody wants to be at the bottom of the leaderboard. So in conclusion, again, benchmarking data is really valuable. That drive or that urge to be better than, or at least not be the worst, both at an enterprise level as well as on an individual team level, that can spur behavior and get people to do the things that you want them to do. You got to show value early and often. If you're going to be doing benchmarking, you have to be able to say, or you have to be able to show on the other side, we made a change in maturity, and that allowed for a change in our performance that we're going to view as being better. Where fewer security vulnerabilities introduced, vulnerabilities fixed faster, fewer things made into production, whatever those measures might be, whichever ones are going to resonate in your organization, you've got to be able to show that progress. Again, once you've got your test cases, you want to look at the breadth, how much do you know across the enterprise, because that lets you potentially identify hotspots or trouble teams where you need to focus more on maturity. And finally, over-communicate. This is something where people have to know what you're doing, why you're doing it. You've got to be able to communicate your results to them if you want to keep momentum. And if you would like to email John, you can email him at john@denimgroup.com. Or I'm dan@denimgroup.com, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that folks have. Questions? Oh, there we go. So the question is, do we have any ROI or statistics data? We don't yet, but that's the type of stuff, like initially what we're trying to collect is a data set for the benchmarking of like what other organizations look like. The next step after that, I think, is to look at those outcomes so that we can start to see if you deploy this technology or if you adopt these practices, then we see this reduction, whatever. So we're not there yet, but I think that is the direction that we need to go. And so like right now, we've seen inside of organizations, we've seen folks be able to demonstrate that, hey, we trained this team in whatever, and then look, their vulnerability introduction graph goes down. That's all data that is internal to those organizations that they haven't been folks have been willing to anonymize and release a lot of their, the kind of OpenSAMM maturity level data. We've seen fewer examples of people that are willing to anonymize and release their outcome data. Because if they say, well, hey, we fixed 80% of our vulnerabilities, and then their customers could turn around and be like, well, that means you left 20% of the vulnerabilities in. That's been a challenge. So I think over time, I think the industry needs to get a better set of metrics that they use to describe favorable outcomes. And I also think over time, I think with proper anonymization, hopefully folks will be more willing to release that type of data. Yep.
So I'm actually doing this evaluation of this, but the challenge I'm having to solve is the definition of yes. I'm trying to make it scale. So I'm trying to figure out ways that every yes has a link, right? Because that's the only thing. So there has to be a proof. Right? So every time somebody says I'm doing this, there should be some evidence.
Right. And so what Dennis is talking about is like what evidence, what's the veracity of the data that you're getting? Because if people ask, yeah, like, hey, do you do training? Yeah, we did training. We had like a 1 hour lunch and learn at whatever. And so that's a great question. And the OpenSAMM model accommodates this by having 2 levels, and I forget the description of the levels, but it's essentially like a low level, a high level, or a low level assessment. And a low level or a high level assessment is like a tabletop tell me exercise. Like, how often do you do static analysis? All the time. Like, oh, good work, right? The lower level assessments actually require that type of evidence of, oh, you do static analysis? Cool. Well, let me see the report from last night's run. Like, but that's an excellent point. But a challenge there is, as you increase the requirement for evidence, you decrease lying, which is a net positive, but you also decrease the likelihood of compliance because you increase the requirement. You increase the level of effort required to show that evidence. And one of the things that we've been playing with, and I think this actually dovetails real well, like if you look at things like DevOps pipeline, integrating security into DevOps pipelines and things like that, some cool stuff that we've seen is once you've got that rolled into automation, as the security team, if you're getting all the Jenkins things are sending back the security results, you can collect that data and be like, yeah, they're doing static analysis because their weekly run ran on Tuesday and here's the results, or their nightly build that did that, and I've got that there. And so I think with DevOps, a cool thing about that is certain aspects of OpenSAMM data collection can be automated. As you say, like, hey, you're executing this stuff, cool, well, just like auto send me the evidence. Once you've instrumented that process and have that data flowing up, then from an application security standpoint, from a centralized standpoint, you can say, yeah, I feel like these guys are doing whatever because I can see that they did a manual test here, I can see that they did dynamic or static or whatever it is, and so you're collecting that evidence along the way just as an artifact of that stuff being included there. So, great question. Any other questions? Yes? Right, and so the question is, how does the benchmarking compare to BSIMM? That's what we're working to see. I don't think we have enough data yet, although I think I've talked to a couple people, and I'm hoping to collect a whole bunch more data. I think we're in the couple tens of records right now, and hoping to be 80 to 100 here shortly. That'll give us like record parity from a sample size with the BSIMM folks. I would argue that their data is collected in a more structured manner at this point. So I think that the OpenSAMM data, the data set, should be north of there so that you can kind of slice and dice and adjust for the variability in the collection. But I think it'll be really interesting to see the juxtaposition of those data sets once we've got a little bit more and can start publishing stuff. Uh-huh.
So who owns particular results, right? So what I'm trying to do is get the network of security champions, or security advocates, whatever it's called, to own it.
Uh-huh.
And then the cybersecurity team verifies the supports. But the logic is a member of the team itself.
Right. And
or is it AppSec team owns it?
yeah. And so your question is, who owns the result of your OpenSAMM testing internally? Right. Okay, yeah. And so in most organizations we see that are pushing on OpenSAMM, they have an app security team, like a central app security team, and they're the ones that ultimately own that. They may have liaisons or embeds in the different teams, but ultimately that data rolls up centrally. And I think that gives you the value of being able to juxtapose teams against one another if you can have a central authority that says, we've collected data from 10 out of our 50 development teams, and here's how they ended up, as opposed to each team kind of saying like, it's tough to get buy-in on OpenSAMM across the teams without some sort of central authority to promote that, I think.
It's a very good idea about gamification, and having different teams within an organization compete with each other. But I see it might be quite difficult to implement because no one likes the limits.
Right.
So what's your advice of turning this seemingly mundane activity that no one likes, as you mentioned at the beginning, into a fun exercise?
Right, so how do you take an activity that no one likes, which is software security benchmarking, and make it into a fun activity? I think that I don't have a great answer for that yet, but what I think we have seen is that if you can get to a certain critical mass, that is if you can kind of like bully your way into a certain critical mass of we have X number of teams have done this, then that starts to encourage compliance for the other folks. And again, on the carrot side versus the stick side, gift cards and things like that can be used. So that may be the strategy like that. We've seen that be very effective. Again, and if you're saying like you're saving me an hour-long meeting and it cost me a $25 gift card, like done and done. Like that's I'll do that every day of the week. If you can do that to get to a certain population with a certain percentage of the population, then that encourages compliance because it shows like, well, all these other guys have done it. I would love, I don't know if you can make the collection of that data fun, but as I talked about with Dennis, if you're starting to instrument pipelines and things like that, you might not be able to make the data collection fun, but you can make the data collection automatic, which is even better than fun, because then it doesn't take anyone's time, it just happens. So, good. All right, well, thank you all very much, and I'll be around if you check it out.